Well, I got to put y'all on notice today because, as we did a couple of weeks ago, you're going to have to talk this time. It's a new sermon series. We're starting some things out fresh, and so I'm going to be asking y'all some questions, and, well, I'm looking forward to hear what y'all have to say. Fair warning here, I'm going to ask you to wait to speak until Crystal's going to be running around with the mic again. Thank you, Crystal. And I'm going to ask y'all to wait to speak until you have the mic in front of your face so that everyone in here and everyone online, everyone who's with us online, can hear you. Can we all agree to that? Is that okay? Except for the choir, Ruth says. Yeah, Ruth projects well enough to be heard online, so we're good. Well, here's my opening question. Here's what I want us to consider today. Where is the hardest place that you have ever had to drive?
When it comes to driving Washington, D.C.
I have a feeling that'll be a theme.
New York City, in Harlem.
Oh. Boy, man, y'all are taking it right out of my mouth, I'm telling you. Linda said Atlanta, Georgia.
Atlanta, Georgia, where we're going Tuesday.
We'll offer double prayers for the Gregorys today.
Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
All right, now the Yankee comes out. We all get it. Ruth said Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. For me, I think it would be either D.C. or Atlanta. Grew up in D.C., went to seminary in Atlanta. When I was in seminary, I had this rule, okay? I told myself this is what I was going to do anytime I had to drive somewhere. If I was going to have to get somewhere before 10 or after 2, okay, before 10 o'clock in the morning or after 2 o'clock in the evening, in the afternoon, I should say, I probably needed to give myself about an hour to get there. And that could be 6 miles down the road, 2 miles down the road, a mile down the road, 100 yards down the road. You really never knew quite what you were getting into in Atlanta. And of course, I grew up in Northern Virginia, and growing up in Northern Virginia, as a lot of y'all know, you have to make similar calculations. You have to budget in about 30 minutes to an hour to get just about anywhere. The DMV veteran over here, Joyce, is nodding and agreeing with me. In both places, whether you're trying to, get somewhere in downtown Atlanta or you're trying to get anywhere in Northern Virginia, really, the traffic and the parking is always terrible. Always terrible. In both places, you're liable to be lost for hours, if you miss a single turn. And that is fact. That's something I personally experienced more times than I would care to share with the good people in this sanctuary right now. And in both places, if you're driving with another person, I'd say there's a pretty good chance that the person sitting in the passenger seat at some point will look at you and go, "Turn here. Turn here. Turn here. Turn here." Maybe that's just me, I don't know. I mention this, and we've all got this common experience. I mention this because you only have to live in the world and to live on your own for a few years before you discover that, you know what? Life is kind of like driving through downtown Atlanta or downtown Washington, D.C., isn't it? Life is like that. You make wrong turns, you make mistakes, you drive, you try to figure things out, you get surprised by your surroundings. As with driving, life requires that we make choices. And as with driving, sometimes we don't always make the best choices or the right choices in a given moment, in a given decision. It's hard to be not just a good driver, it's hard to be a decent person sometimes, isn't it? Let's be honest about that. There are some times when it's hard to do what we know we should do. We're taught as children something pretty simple. Some things are right, some things are wrong. There's a clear line between the two. In reality, oftentimes, in real time, the line between the two is less like a clear line drawn on a blackboard and more like a line in the sand drawn with a stick on a windy day with the tide coming in. Contrary to what the song says, life is not a highway. Life is not a long, straight line full of easy decisions and cruising along at top speed. Life is more like driving through the downtown area of a major city. There are stops, there are lane changes, there are unexpected turns, there are road closures, and of course, there are lots of idiots out there who make your job a lot harder when you're trying to get from point A to point B. And because of all this, it can be hard to figure out in real time what difference there actually is between right and wrong, good and bad. We struggle with this as individuals. We struggle with this as groups of people. And sad to say, but truthful to say, we are no closer to figuring out how to do this consistently than we ever have been, ever in our history. So this makes my next question rather easy to answer if we just consider this question in light of what I just said. Here's my next question for y'all. Who among us is perfect? None of us are. I'm not, you're not, none of us are. It's just a fact. None of us do everything we should do. None of us avoid doing everything we shouldn't do. And here's the really key part of that, the reason why that happens. None of us can say that we know in any and every situation what exactly we should do, what the right choice is. None of us always manages to think, feel, and act exactly how we know we should or we think that we should. And our passage for today actually testifies to that reality, doesn't it? In our passage today, we see Jesus speaking to a group of people who are defined as confident in their own righteousness. This is what unites this group of people. This is what defines these people who are present. They think they're really great. And maybe they have some evidence to back it up. Maybe there are some things that they do. It sounds like the Pharisee in question, he tithes well, he fasts well, he stays in touch with God. He sounds like a decent enough guy. He thinks he's really great. It sounds like he does some decent stuff along the way. But Jesus, being Jesus, he is there to do what he always does. He's there to tip over their apple cart. He's there to upend their perceptions. He's there to challenge them and get them to think and do and act and be and truly be better. And he does so with two examples. The first example is a man whose moral self-confidence is off the charts. A man who believes that he truly is the best guy out there. And then he turns to another man, a man who seems to have no moral self-confidence whatsoever. At first glance, that distinction seems pretty simple, seems pretty straightforward. But the more you think about it, it's actually kind of revolutionary. I have another question to ask you. When you were a kid, or when you were growing up, who were your moral examples? Who were your moral examples? Who were the people who taught you, who showed you by living how you too should live?
My mother and father, especially my mother, and my Sunday school teachers. I think I paid more attention to them than the pastor.
That hangs true, doesn't it, Barbara?
Mrs. Turner, Mrs. Bennett, my vacation Bible school teachers when I was 8 years old, and my preacher, John Wesley Inge.
My parents and my grandmother.
Grandparents.
Diane, did you say parents? Yeah, when they're in attendance, yeah. That does help, yeah. As people, we're drawn to the examples of other people, aren't we? It's kind of instinctive. We like to look to others for guidance. We don't know always where we're going, so when we see someone else on the road ahead of us, it's a lot easier to just follow them and trust in them and let them lead us to where we want to go. We want to understand how to live in the world, and having someone to imitate on that pursuit is really, really helpful. But today, Jesus takes that concept, takes that idea, and he twists it on its head. He turns it around, he makes it into something that kind of surprises and challenges. As he corrects his listeners, he doesn't give them an example of one guy who is terrible and one guy who is great, and then tell them they are more like the terrible guy and need to be more like the great guy. They are like the bad one. They need to follow after the good one. What he tells them is to follow a man who says, God, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner. He tells them to emulate the example of someone who is not a good person or does not see himself as a good person. Because today, Jesus isn't preaching against bad behavior. He's not here to reprimand people for acting badly. He's here to reprimand people for thinking badly. He isn't preaching about necessarily right and wrong, good and evil. He's preaching about moral self-confidence. And what he's telling us is that moral self-confidence itself is the problem. It's not about being a certain kind of person. It's not about acting a certain kind of way. It's that when you think you have it all figured out, you had better believe, Jesus tells us, that you are further away than you have ever been. He's reminding us that as we try to navigate through the twisting and the turning and the winding and the rising and falling streets of life, it isn't our own hearts and our own minds that are here to serve as our guides. It's the heart and mind of God, which is meant to be our guide, which is meant to take us through the challenging drives that we all have ahead of us. And as we continue to explore the question together of what it means to be disciples, which has united and bound this entire year of worship together, as we explore that question, especially as we explore it within the bounds of a Christian institution that kind of seems to be receding at different times, we've talked about that a lot, it might be worthwhile for us to remember this truth. Yes, we are meant to be inclusive. Yes, we are meant to be kind. Yes, we are meant to be welcoming. These are all things that a church should be. But as we do so, we cannot dilute the meaning of the word Christian. Faith is supposed to change us. Faith is supposed to grow us into a specific kind of person. That kind of person is one who submits to God, surrenders to God, and follows God through the fires and the furies and the storms of life. This is what it means to be a Christian. This is what it means to be a member of a church. This is what it means to be here, right now, today. That is why we are here. And if we're going to be that person, if we're truly going to be that person, we're going to have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. We're going to have to embrace uncertainty, moral humility, not just as individuals, but as a community, as a collection of people who are gathered together to worship. We are meant to embrace this uncertainty and to do so as a community, and we are meant to model for the world what it looks like to live life as a family of people who all know together that their lives are not their own. So here's my final question for today. My final question to ask y'all. Why is this good news? Teresa said we're all sinners.
Yes, we're all sinners, but it brings great joy to our lives. A comfort, a peace.
Any other thoughts?
And we are covered by God's love and grace.
Ruth said we are covered by God's love and grace. There's truth to that, for certain. Any others?
We can always rely on Jesus to help us no matter what.
There we go. To be clear here, our passage for today must be good news because the gospel is good news. It has to be a good thing. But it seems a little bit weird to call uncertainty and embracing uncertainty, to turn the light off as we walk through life. Feels a little weird to call that good news, doesn't it? At least at first brush, at least at first glance. And if that's what you're feeling right now, if that's what you're thinking, well, I would say this to you. It's not like uncertainty only finds us through the Bible, right? We feel uncertainty all the time. Have you had uncertain days? I have. I'm sure most of us have once or twice. Days in which you had to make a decision and it was a really hard decision to make, and instead of choosing between a clear good and a clear bad, you had to weigh things and hope that one was just a little bit heavier than the other. Have you had a day when you had to make a choice and you didn't know, you just couldn't figure out what choice to make? Have you been there? We've all been there once or twice. Have you had a day in which you felt paralyzed by fear, but you knew that somehow you had to do something? We've been there. Sometimes in life, we make a wrong turn. Sometimes in life, we find ourselves in a dangerous neighborhood, late at night, low on gas, with no cell service. Sometimes that's just what happens. The gospel isn't demanding that we leave certainty behind because the gospel wants to torture us. The gospel is demanding that we leave certainty behind because the gospel recognizes that life itself is uncertain, that life itself is uneasy, that life itself is challenging. It is hard. God is not asking us to exit off of a safe road here. God is trying to help us find the safe road, not punishing us for driving, for leaving the house, but reminding us that life is so much easier when we go down the road with God as opposed to without God. So if there is good news to be found in our passage for today, and I personally believe that there is, it is because, as Jesus tells us, to embrace the worldview of this tax collector, this pitiful man who can't even look up because of his awareness of his own guilt. He's also reminding us that we get to be free from the requirements of certainty. Yes, we must lean on God for guidance, but also we get to lean on God for guidance. Because though we might want to find our own way, though we might be tempted to trust our own instincts, in the deep, dark places of all of our hearts, the places we hide from others, the places we might even hide from ourselves, in those deep, dark places, we all know how hard life can be. And we all know how easy it is to get lost when we try to go it alone. So over the next few weeks, as we explore what the church is, and as we ponder the question of why we are needed in this world in which we live, I hope that we will all remember this truth, that what makes a Christian and what makes a church is the conviction, the incarceration, and the liberation that comes from the knowledge that we are lost. Because it is in this knowledge, in this admission, that we can begin to truly see who we are meant to be. We cannot find our own way. Fortunately, we don't have to, because God is with us in all things. In a world of panic, we can be steadfast. In a world of arrogance, we can be humble. In a world of frantic action, of constant feverish fear, we can rest in the sure and certain knowledge that God's love provides. Because if our lives are not our own, it is by surrendering our lives to God that we ourselves can find our way home and be made perfect in the love of God that is in Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen.